Hello, this is Ruth Bruner. Today is May 23rd, 2024, and I am here at Clearview Library with Erich Ehrlich. And we're going to talk today about his family and what he remembers about the businesses they owned in downtown Windsor. So, Erich, you want to state your full name?
Yeah, sure. It's Erich Eugene Ehrlich.
Okay, and who were your grandparents and what businesses do you remember in downtown Windsor?
Yeah, so my grandparents were Walter and Rachel Ehrlich, and they were business owners in downtown Windsor through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up until 2012 when my grandmother passed away. And they were, back in the earlier decades, they had Ehrlich Clothing, and before that it was Olson's, and it was like a Mercantile, and in today's world it would be like a Bumgard's or a Big R. And so at that time in history with Windsor, the farmers and ranchers would come into Windsor to trade or do business with Ehrlich Clothing, Mercantile. And so it was just like coming in, and there was clothes, and there was different things of tools, supplies, and so that was a way of good business. And from what I remember being told is sometimes it was always on a ledger, and it was trade, because they would say, hey, if that farmer had beef, they would trade out, for some clothing. But with the principle of just a handshake and honesty, there was a ledger. And I remember my grandfather, Walter, always did everything accounting off of a ledger, and he would spend nights at the clothing store or back where they lived up until 2012, which was on the corner of 4th and Walnut, right across from Bethel Lutheran Church, back in his office. And ironically, I still have his desks out at my place. But he would have ledgers, and it would have Ehrlich, and then it would say what was done that day of trade and the dollar amount. And he would always go in and cross things out or check it out. And then where the Hearth, I guess, is what everybody recognizes today on the other corner of 4th and Main Street, there are units down below, and that was also owned by Walter and Rachel Ehrlich. And as kids, my dad, Gene Ehrlich, or my cousins, we would always have to go in there, and if there was a tenant that moved out, we were ripping out carpet, painting walls. The Volga Germans, if there was a dirt floor or if there was anything of a floor, I had hours and hours with my cousins of a broom in my hand, always sweeping out the front entrance, always making sure there was never any snow if it snowed. And so those are all really, really, really good memories, even though back then, as a young kid and then teenage years, you're like, why do I have to do this? But hindsight being what it is, it's the installing work ethic and just being appreciative of what you have and taking care of what you got. But then before I was born, though, where the flower shop is, or was, yeah. There was another building that they owned there too, and I don't remember. There's been through the 50 years, a lot of tenants or people that have lived in there, but I don't remember much of that part. But the Ehrlich Clothing side was always next to Manweiler's, and Manweiler's have been in Windsor as a business for, I don't want to date them, but probably at least 70 or 80 years. And so the hardware store with Manweiler's, they were there. And then right next door, growing up, I remember it was called Gamble's, and it was the Gamble's building. And then after Ehrlich Clothing closed its doors, which in the significance of Windsor history is that was the time Kodak came in the early 70s. And so my grandfather, Walter, being part of the Windsor Chamber of Commerce downtown business for 25 years before that, or 30 years, he was courted by Kodak, Eastman Kodak, to run their janitorial division.
Oh,
So my grandfather went to go work, as many people did in 1972, 73, 74, to go work for Eastman Kodak. And so he then went and worked for Eastman Kodak. And so then Ehrlich Clothing, then I remember I wasn't doing any of the work. These were my older cousins. But they actually took and created 2 different units in there, so could be 2 different businesses. And for anybody that would remember, in the early 2000s, even to date, is when you go there now next to Manuel Appliance, there's like a thrift store or a knick-knack store. And so we would go into those units, and they were all hardwood floors. And so we were always sweeping the floors.
So what do you attribute to your grandparents' work ethic, and how did they get into like the clothing business? Do you know anything about what they did back in Volga, Germany, Volga, Russia, or what? Why were they not the farmers, or how did they get started in that business?
Yeah, great question. Because so they are Volga Germans, and they come from the village of Grim, Russia, which is in that Volga River Valley, the Volga River there, which, as many people would already probably know, is that is a fertile ground, similar ground to the Poudre Valley, which is here for farming. And then the ancestry with Catherine the Great, the Germans all came from Germany, which was along the Rhine River Valley, which that is a very fertile farm. So the lineage of my family, much like a lot of the Germans, Volga Germans that came to Windsor, were farmers. And my grandfather had 4 brothers, actually 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And they all came over, 3 of them came over in 1903. And then my grandfather was born in 1915 in Chicago, Illinois, as they were making their way here to Fort Collins, Windsor area. Originally, because it was letters that were being passed across, to Russia. So family that was here, or acquaintances, or people to get away from what they feared was going to be the suppression and things that happened with Stalin back in Bolsheviks and stuff. Yeah.
So then, how did they finance opening a store? Have you ever wondered about that?
No,
did you ask?
I did. Yeah, I did because all of those brothers became farmers.
Yeah.
And so my grandfather wasn't a very good farmer.
Oh, well.
And so they farmed in Windsor, around where Tozier Primary School was. They farmed there. Then they farmed north of town on the corner of County Road 74 and 257. They farmed there for a lot of years. He just wasn't a very good farmer. And so my grandmother, Rachel, when they were in town, which is in Windsor now, farming, she would go to work for the Olsons, who owned the Mercantile clothing store before. So she was working for the Olsons, and luck would have it that the Olsons went to my grandmother Rachel and said, well, we're done with this. Would you like to take it over? So then, I'm sure talks were had or whatever, and my grandmother told my grandfather, you need to quit farming. And so that started Ehrlich Clothing, and then the opportunity for them to buy buildings in downtown Windsor, and then they had a couple rental properties, and at that time that was all around like Chimney Park, where Chimney Park Pool is. A lot of those original homes that were built in the 1920s and 30s. They had a couple houses that were over there. So that's how they got started in the business side versus farming.
Business side, because we don't often realize that Windsor had a lot of businesses downtown. that we don't have today. I mean, we have interesting businesses, but we don't have a true, like, Mercantile or clothing store that you can get everything at that you need.
Yeah.
Was there certain nights of the week that they would come to town, the farmers, or was there hours that they were open, or?
Well, it was just normal business hours, but I do remember that Sundays they closed Sundays, so Sundays were family and what have you. But yeah, Monday through Saturday, and it was just your commerce, and it would just be as people would come in to do business or what have you. I mean, obviously at that time, through those decades, there was still obviously people that lived in town, and so it was very easy. But you know, the whole idea of community in small town is everybody supported each other and everybody kind of stayed self-sufficient with where they're at. And then now you look at the complexity of northern Colorado, that everybody goes to other towns, other cities to do business, have dinners. When you brought that up about how people would just stay in town, I remember in 1976 or 77 going to Star Wars at the movie theater in Windsor, which is where the gazebo is today, next to Red Zone.
Yes.
On the corner of 5th and Main. There was a movie theater there. And then when I talked to my dad and his cousins, they would go to the movie theater for 10 cents, and they would be able to go to a movie and get a pop and a popcorn, and then they would do that, and then they'd walk back to, you know, wherever they lived. At that time, it was pretty much 1st Street to 7th Street.
Yeah, no, that was kind of the main residential area. We take for granted how much Windsor's grown. So, tell me what kind of businesses you remember being underneath the Hearth. I know there's that red brick building on 4th and Main Street. There was the Why Not Cafe, and then when I moved here in '74. So
so the Why Not Tavern was right on the corner, and you know, cafe, like you said, you could get a lunch, you could get libations, and you could have some fun there. That was kind of a hangout point. Then through the years, my oldest aunt, Frances Specht, and Betty Martin had Country Clips and Curls, which was just a little hair salon. And so I remember going in there and getting a haircut, and then after a haircut, maybe having to sweep the floors. You know, always come back and sweep the floors. And then, you know, and then there was like Blockbuster Video.
Yeah, that's right.
It was called Budget Movie Rentals. And you used to be able to go in there, and it was a big blue case, a VCR that you could rent with a couple VCRs. And so kids in the 70s, 80s, 90s, VCR time or whatever, you know, on the weekends, you would go and hang out at a buddy's house or whatever and watch movies. And then there was the Electronics Center, which was before its time like a modern day Radio Shack. And Electronics Center was just anything to do with car electronics or household electronics. And you could go in there and get a radio, or you could get headphones or binoculars or whatever. Those are the ones that I remember being in there the longest, going through 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
Yeah, I think the Budget movie moved over to Windsor West Shopping Center.
Could be. In
the late 80s. But it was first there, and they were VHS tapes that you had to rewind them before you brought them back. Or they'd charge you a fee or that. So what was the Why Not Cafe like? Did it have a shuffleboard table? The little. So I was really still pretty young, but it was what you would imagine, where you walk in and then there was a
bar stools and bar, and then there was shuffleboard table, and I think there was a pool table, and then in the back side in the lot, you could come in through the back there too. The kitchen was just right in the very back. That's in all of those units, the Gamble's building, we'll just call it the Hearth building now, or the building that was over where used to be the flower shop next to that, because I want to say the Winters, Bob and Janet Winter
Yes.
owned that in like the
That's right.
80s.
They did put a flower shop
Because they
in
had
there.
the flower shop. All of the utilities or the mechanics were always in the back of the building or rear of the building, and so that's where if there was any opportunity for a retro of a kitchen or bathroom or utilities, that was always where those were found. The other intriguing thing about Walter and Rachel Ehrlich is that behind the Gamble's building, all that stuff up, and it actually still is today, it was all dirt lots, and it was usually just for parking for the tenants or people that work there to keep people not parking onto Main Street. So Main Street was for the clients or for people to have access to enter in at the front entrance. There was an old outbuilding that sat parallel to the Union Pacific Railroad, and then after you'd see the outbuilding, you'd go across the railroad, and then now what's existing is Boardwalk Park. But in that outbuilding right there was my coin today, my grandfather's like man cave or man shed. And so I remember always having to go out with my cousins to his shop to get materials, because not just the Volga Germans, but that's my heritage and lineage, is that they kept everything from nails, screws, pieces of wood, trim, anything that was left over from doing a tenant finish inside those units. We would first go out there first before my grandfather was even willing to go and buy new stuff. So we learned how to take what we had to make it work. And they were all in a Folger can buckets, like that would be a bucket of nails, or mason jar would have bolts in it, and they would be all put up, and it wasn't like a disaster. It was organized. So you could go in, and if he said, or my grandma, which actually was more, Rachel Ehrlich was really kind of more of the take charge. Kind of like, hey, you go out to the shed and get 6 2x4s and bring them over to the Gamble's building or bring them over to the Hearth building. And so we would go grab it and we just walk to those locations to do stuff. So I have to give that little history of Walter and Rachel Ehrlich, that shop. I always looked at it as like the shop of death, because that was where all the work was going to start. And then too is the private property or people taking or were appreciative of their properties. There was never any weeds. And so even though I was out in a dirt lot, we would have to go out there and hoe and rake if there was starting to be any weeds around that railroad track maintenance or machine shed, if you want to call it. And even if there was any weeds or anything in the back lots of those properties, get it taken care of.
And did you guys own those, or how did that work? Because I know there's a lot going on with the DDA right now in downtown on what's called the back lots.
Yeah, so that was, that back lot was owned up by what was called W.R. Ehrlich, which stood for Walter and Rachel Ehrlich. That was the name of the company up until like 2002, 2004, and then it was sold, the lot and that machine shed that was there. So then the machine shed disappeared because the person that bought it didn't need that but had that lot. And then with the emergence of the DDA and everything that they're doing of revitalization and stuff with the downtown district, it came about that Walter and Rachel Ehrlich still owned dirt.
Yeah.
And so through the mishap of just recording of property deeds, or just however all that came about, W.R. Ehrlich donated the small amount, it wasn't very much, to help assist with the DDA to complete a portion of the project that they needed from 4th to 5th Street.
Yeah. Now, how about that mural that's the building just east, with a empty lot just east of what's now Manweiler Appliance and the thrift store building. And it has, what up above it, that building has the lodge. It's the Mason Lodge with the staircase.
Yeah.
And so they've redeveloped that lot there. I'm trying to get people to know where we're at.
Yeah.
Put a mural up with the history of Windsor. What do you know about that lot and that area?
So that lot was just another piece of dirt that just wasn't accounted for really by anything other than W.R. Ehrlich owned it. And that dirt lot, though, in trying to just talk to ancestors or people that are, still alive, and through the last probably 7 years, that was always there. If you can go and take a look at pictures, even back to like the 50s, there was, for some reason, there was just that open entry.
Was there an implement dealer somewhere? Someone had said there was, in the building further east was implement dealer, or there was a welding shop.
Yeah, so
and
where...
so that was a place they could advertise with machinery. Or
I'm not sure if Manweilers did or did not, but I think that Manweilers had back in the earlier Herb Manweiler, if I get that right, did have some implements.
Yeah.
But anyways, that piece that's right there is now a entry or walkway of opportunity for people to hang out and sit. They've got chairs and stuff that will create an access to go and get over to Boardwalk Park.
Which is beautiful.
Which is really cool, yeah.
What do you remember about Boardwalk Park, the lake, Windsor Lake, as a kid? Because you could have gone from the tool shed out to the lake and go swimming and disappear from work.
Yeah, so never really experienced what we remember as Windsor Lake. However, there was a swimming pool that was out there where now is the museum of some buildings.
Yeah, it's right, sitting in that open grass area where the depot.
Yep, exactly.
East of the depot.
And so the experience in the 80s was we would have with what was called Windsor Dolphins. Mm-hmm. It was a swim club. That's where we swam, was in that swimming pool outside. Mm-hmm. And everybody talks about, growing up that you had to go to school uphill both ways in the snow with no shoes to make it sound like it was really miserable. I don't remember ever there being a pool that was heated as a kid. So if we were swimming, it was cold. Yeah. But that's where kids in 70s and 80s would go if they wanted to go swimming. And then the new swimming area became Chimney Park, which has been there for decades. Yeah. But everybody went in terms of families, if it was Sundays, to the Windsor Main Park for picnics. Uh-huh. So the Ehrlich family picnic, which was Walter and Rachel and then all Ehrlichs in northern Colorado, the third Sunday in August every year was the family picnic.
Okay.
And so growing up as a kid, that was really fun because the main park is really where my generation and I want to say the generation before, which would be my dad's generation and his cousins, that main park was kind of the community park. When I say main park, Windsor Main Park, because there's so many parks now.
The one on 3rd between Locust and Elm.
Yeah, just to the south of the town hall.
And there's the big fire chimney cookout area there where the picnic shelter is. off of 3rd Street that the Lions Club built. Did you ever use that to cook in, or what did you use? Or
Usually a lot of that by the aunts and grandmas, that was already pre-cooked, because at that time, which I miss dearly today, was German sausage,
yeah,
Grebbel, noodles with butter,
yeah.
kraut burgers. So there
They
was,
baked them in their oven,
and then they put them in the pans, and then they put a cover over it, and then just brought it out there, and everybody would sit. But that gazebo, I don't know when that gazebo was built, if it was when it was built with the main park in the 10s or 20s. When those families would get together, because if that was the 3rd Sunday in August for the Ehrlich family picnic, there were other families that were doing it too, and I could go through all kinds of names that have been around at that time. So ironically, if it was asked by another family or whatever, Johnny Fritzler and the Polka Tunes,
oh yes,
or Holman would go and set up in that gazebo, and they would play, which we call it a Dutch hop. They would play polka, and so you would see kind of the older generation maybe doing a little polka, and then the kids were just all out there frolicking and jumping around, and so that's why I'm pretty sure that Sundays you couldn't go anywhere downtown in Windsor, because everybody was spending time either going to church, and then after that was family picnics.
yeah, wow, those are wonderful memories, Eric. Before we close, I want to make sure we mention now Rachel, your grandmother, what was her maiden name, and then any of the cousins that you've mentioned, so maybe they might have photos or information about even that lot where they now have the mural, or any facts we spoke of that, because I know you've lost a lot of the older generations, but tell us about those so we make sure we acknowledge them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rachel's maiden name was Rhein, which is another Volga German, and that family, the Rheins, also came across in the same Saratov Valley. Now, she had 11 siblings.
Okay,
And
so
then,
we don't have to name all
yeah,
of them.
yeah, it's
but
okay. But then Walter Ehrlich, like I said, he had 6. One brother died at 3 coming across in 1903, just because of influenza and diseases and stuff that were on boats, much like any other families that had to suffer that journey across the Atlantic Ocean. But then Walter and Rachel Ehrlich had Francis, which is Francis Speck,
okay,
Mary, which one goes by Nikki Bottoms,
okay,
Carolyn Markheim.
okay,
Then the youngest was Jean Ehrlich, which is my dad.
yes,
And then during the younger years, Walter and Rachel Ehrlich had a daughter named Florence, and at age 20 or 21, she died of leukemia.
oh,
So that was a passage, as much like many families have to deal with. So that was probably a dark time for the family at that time. But that is the lineage of Walter and Rachel Ehrlich in Windsor. And we would run out of time with all the brothers, but there are a lot of cousins and
Yes, you spoke
great
of the
uncles,
cousins.
great aunts. And then my immediate cousins from Francis down to Jean Ehrlich, my sister Allison, her last name's now Tater, she still lives here in town. And then my cousin Kirk Markheim, he still lives here in town. Otherwise, all the other cousins have moved and live in other states.
yeah.
So, the generation families have kind of shrunk down, and it's really cool that the Windsor Severance Historical Society does this, because it's a history of our community. And then as the Historical Society continues to still do this footprint, 50 years from now, they'll be talking about things that we're talking about in 2024.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to be able to, and it wasn't maybe necessarily me asking all the questions, but as I got older, I wanted to just know more about Walter and Rachel Ehrlich, because I had heard that they were good stewards of the business community, and they were a bloodline, much like many other business owners that were there to give back to the community, be in the community, eat, breathe, and sleep in the community, and that we saw a lot of that in the tornado 16 years ago in 2008. Everybody gets together on that.
Yeah, so that's great. It's really my pleasure to interview you and capture this moment of history of downtown Windsor that we often take for granted. So thank you for your time, Erich.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth.